So the point of this video is just to go through the topic of the Downing Street Declaration, which is a significant step as we move towards the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, which preludes it. Of course, we've already talked about the Downing Street Declaration earlier in the year, but that was a separate, different Downing Street Declaration. That was another declaration that just happens to be announced at Downing Street. So you can see I've put in brackets to help differentiate here, and you need to know this because you could get asked a question about the Downing Street Declaration 1969. You could get asked a question about the Downing Street Declaration 1993. You need to know which is which. So the 1993 Downing Street Declaration is with Albert Reynolds, the man you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, the Irish Taoiseach, and John Major with the glasses on the left side of the image. These two people, he was the British Prime Minister who succeeded Thatcher. These two people issued a joint declaration in 1993, which is supposed to push towards the peace process itself. And as I said, is a big step towards it. The previous one, the 1969 Downing Street Declaration, is more about dealing with violence which had broken out in the streets of Northern Ireland from 1968. So just keep in mind they are two separate things. You need to know what both of them are, but you need to know how they are different also. So as you can see here, there's a little bit at the start. We need to explain the significance of the Humes-Adams initiative. Hopefully you know who both those people are already. The next thing then is to identify steps towards the Downing Street Declaration. Can you tell me the reasons for the Downing Street Declaration coming about? The next learning intention is describe the terms of the Downing Street Declaration 1993. So can you just tell me what they declared, what was in that agreement? And lastly, the responses, as always, to the declaration. Quickly getting into it then. The Downing Street Declaration of 1993 was a declaration from Downing Street signed by the British and Irish governments. So they are John Major, the British Prime Minister on the left, and Albert Reynolds, the Irish Taoiseach, on the right. And it laid the foundations upon which a peaceful settlement would later be built in Northern Ireland. And one big step towards that, and why it comes about, one of the reasons for it, is the Humes-Adams initiatives, or the Humes-Adams talks, as they'll sometimes be referred to as. And that is in 1988. These begin when John Hume, the man on the right of the image at the bottom of the screen, the leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, the biggest nationalist party in Northern Ireland, thought that talks with Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, who had been elected in 1983 following the hunger strikes as the MP for Belfast West, could help to end the IRA campaign. So Hume believes that if he talks with Gerry Adams and he talks with Sinn Féin, he could help bring about an end to the IRA's armed struggle, as they called it. Humes wanted to convince Republicans that the British government was neutral on Northern Ireland's future, meaning that he truly believes the British government doesn't mind whether Northern Ireland wants to be part of the Republic of Ireland as a United Ireland or part of the United Kingdom, as is currently the case. And he wants to set that sort of convince Sinn Féin of that, in order to persuade them to move more towards using politics as opposed to political violence. And that is because he wants Republicans to begin to prioritize electoral politics over political violence. And that's something we've seen beginning to creep in following the hunger strikes. We know after the hunger strikes that Republicans begin to use the Armalite and the ballot box. I suppose the main goal for John Hume here is to try and persuade Gerry Adams to make Republicans use the ballot box primarily, and eventually over time get rid of the Armalite altogether. So just using politics, not political violence. Sinn Féin wanted to develop a more respectable image because that's not mince our words here. Sinn Féin was and is the provisional IRA's political wing. So they want a more respectable image so they can actually be involved in any peace talks in the future. And they thought that by talking to the SDLP, the peaceful political party for Catholics, for nationalists, and John Hume, who was a very well-respected figure, this could give them respect through talks. Sinn Féin's support had actually been decreasing, particularly after controversial moments in the IRA's campaign, such as the 1987 Poppy Day bombing in Enniskillen, which we previously mentioned. It was very, very controversial, even by usual standards for the IRA's actions. They were hoping, essentially, by talking to Hume and the SDLP, that it would increase their legitimacy as a political party, make them more normalised, and it would allow them to be part of any future negotiations on peace in Northern Ireland. The talks were highly controversial, and Hume was criticised by unionists His own party was divided, with his own deputy leader, Seamus Mallon, against the talks. So he faces opposition, John Hume, within his own party for talking to Adams. However, Hume had been convinced of Sinn Féin's desire for peace, and he began to push the British government to give Republicans a path away from political violence. And that is where this idea of the Downing Street Declaration comes about. Essentially, after talking for quite a few years to Gerry Adams, Hume is serious in his belief that Sinn Féin is serious in their belief about seeking peaceful alternatives to the armed struggle, as they would have called it. And Hume takes it upon himself then to try and persuade the British government, give these people a path away from violence, give them a path towards political, everyday, normal political life, constitutional politics or electoral politics, which doesn't involve violence. And that is kind of why the Downing Street Declaration comes about. It's a way for the British government, the Irish governments, to move Republicans away from the Armalite and towards the ballot box. The next big step step towards the reason for the Downing Street Declaration of 1993 is the principle of consent. So in 1992, Sinn Féin published a paper called Towards a Lasting Peace. And in this document, it was revealed a sort of huge, really significant change in their strategy, in that there was a massive reduction in Republicans' emphasis on the armed struggle. Instead, Sinn Féin were beginning to focus on something called self-determination. And you can see the definition of this here. Self-determination is the right of the people to determine for themselves the future of Northern Ireland. Essentially, the right of the people of Northern Ireland to choose for themselves. The principle of consent, i.e., the people of Northern Ireland must give their consent to unity. You can't force it through violence. And so as Sinn Féin announce or signal this movement towards self-determination, the right of people to determine for themselves Northern Ireland's future, it really is a significant step towards the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, as it's showing the British and Irish governments, just as John Hume has been saying, that Sinn Féin and Gerry Adams are increasingly serious about moving away from political violence and more towards electoral politics, away from the Armalite towards the ballot box. Another significant step, and this is a nice, easy one to remember, is President Mary Robinson, the Irish President, Mary Robinson. Well, as you can see, in 1990, Irish Labour Party Senator Mary Robinson was elected as President of Ireland. You may remember her previously from the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement. In reaction, she actually really disagreed with the Anglo-Irish Agreement because she believed that it was unfair on unionists, and that shows how kind of serious she took the views of both unionists and nationalists in Northern Ireland for a proper peace process. As President of Ireland, she believed in pursuing peace in Northern Ireland as opposed to ending partition. So that begins to make a clear argument in the Republic of Ireland, moving away from this idea of ending partition, moving away from this idea of Irish unity immediately, and more towards just securing a peace process and a peace deal in Northern Ireland. And that is a big step towards the Downing Street Declaration that we see in 1993. The next big one then is clearly and simply the desire for peace. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 had not ended violence. In fact, violence got worse after it. In 1987, the Poppy Day bombing that we talked about killed 11 civilians and was very controversial. In 1991, 31 Catholics, mostly civilians, who were not part of paramilitaries, were killed by loyalist groups. In 1993, the IRA had detonated a bomb in Warrington in England, killing 2 young boys. In 1993, a real significant moment in the conflict here as well, the IRA bombed a chip shop on the Shankill Road at Chippy and killed 9 civilians. And this was a really sort of significant, controversial moment and deeply emotional moment within unionism and loyalism. And all these, events, these bombings, these deaths on both sides, sicken increasingly the people of Northern Ireland, who are becoming more and more off-put by this violence, less able to justify it, and begin in increasing numbers to expect and demand change. They want change and they want an end to violence. And that is a big step towards this Downing Street Declaration. There's appetite and hunger from the people of Northern Ireland for something new, for something different. And the British and the Irish governments have to come up with something to achieve that. You can see here is just an example of a newspaper article on some of the violence that followed throughout the 80s and the 90s. This is to do with the Warrington bomb. Here's the Shankill Road bomb that took place in the Chippy. There you can see the destruction that was caused by that IRA bomb. The next big step then towards the Downing Street Declaration is secret talks, or what's sometimes referred to as the back channel. And this man on the right side of the screen is the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Peter Brooke. So he was the man appointed by the British government, yet another Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And he had ordered the British secret sort of security services to reopen their secret back channel to the IRA. And what this was essentially a private, indirect line of communication between the British government and the leadership of the IRA. So they were not talking directly, they would be talking through other people. In November 1993, this became public. But the fact that both sides were talking built trust between the British and the IRA and highlighted that a new way of thinking was possible and that Republicans were serious about moving away from violence and towards peaceful politics. And that's a big step towards this Downing Street Declaration. The last sort of step towards it, or reason for the Downing Street Declaration, is unionist concerns. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Peter Brooke, as we know, had opened that back channel, but at the same time, he was attempting to establish talks between the main constitutional parties in Northern Ireland. What that means is the main peaceful parties, the parties which are completely committed to the ballot box as opposed to political violence, parties like the SDLP, etc. And as you can see here, unionist concerns over the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the role of Dublin was still a major issue. And so Brooke suspended the intergovernmental conference that had been set up by the Anglo-Irish Agreement to allow talks to take place. As these talks go on, it increases the likelihood of peace coming about, and that again puts further pressure on the British and Irish governments to make a big step towards peace, and that is the Downing Street Declaration. So in terms of the Downing Street Declaration itself, the British government, first of all, British Prime Minister John Major announced that Britain had no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And what he's saying there is that, unlike in the past, where it was in the interest of Britain to control part or all of Ireland for their own defence, and previously, places like Ulster or Northern Ireland had real economic benefit to Britain, now Major was saying they had no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. They have no reason for keeping control of Northern Ireland other than the people of Northern Ireland wanting to remain part of the United Kingdom. Both the British and the Irish government then commit to the idea of self-determination, which is, like Sinn Féin have been talking about, the right of the people of Northern Ireland to choose its future, to determine for themselves the future of the country. The British government would enable a united Ireland if the people of Northern Ireland chose that. And at the same time, they guaranteed the right of the people of Northern Ireland to choose the union. So Irish unification will only take place if the people in Northern Ireland choose for that to happen through a normal democratic vote. But they will always be given the option to remain within the union. He also reasserted British sovereignty over Northern Ireland, meaning the right of Britain to govern Northern Ireland at that point in time. So it's a big change, and it's kind of given an opportunity here to Republicans to walk away from violence by saying there is an opportunity in the future for United Ireland to take place through self-determination, through political decision-making, through a referendum in the future. And that is given Sinn Féin Republicans an out and a movement away from political violence, because they can now tell their supporters there's an opportunity here to achieve what we want through politics as opposed to through the armed struggle. The Irish government then, led by Taoiseach Albert Reynolds, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, announced and agreed that the Irish government would be willing to alter the Irish constitution to remove its claims to Northern Ireland. So as we already know, Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution claimed that Northern Ireland was Irish territory and it wasn't British. And he is making a big statement here and saying we will remove those claims from our constitution, but only on the condition that a peaceful settlement is reached and that it works, that it lasts, that it's effective. Okay, he's accepted at this moment that Irish unity will only take place by the consent of the people peacefully through politics, through no other means. People will have to choose for self determination. So this is meant to kind of appease unionists by saying there's an opportunity here to have the Irish government themselves recognise that Northern Ireland isn't Irish and that it is British, as long as there's a working, peaceful settlement agreement reached. Reactions is our next big bit, and nationalist reactions, well, they are quite positive, I suppose, overall. Sinn Féin welcomes the agreement and the British recognition of United Ireland as a legitimate political goal, because it now is. The British government have accepted that it is legitimate and it is perfectly acceptable for people in Ireland to want a United Ireland, and that can be achieved through political means. However, they aren't completely satisfied, as they think the agreement doesn't go far enough. Sinn Féin knew that unionists would be able to reject the United Ireland because they were the majority. So that is something that still causes them concern, is that, yes, okay, there is a means now through politics to achieve United Ireland, but it's still quite a while off. In January 1994, Republicans actually sought clarification on the declaration, as they were still unsure of supporting it. So they actually go back to the British and Irish governments and ask for a bit more clarification, a bit more clarity and detail. In January 1994, then, US President Bill Clinton granted Gerry Adams, the leader of Sinn Féin, a visa to travel to the United States, where Adams met with Irish American groups who promised economic support, investment for Northern Ireland should there be a peace process. And in the summer of 1994, the IRA began to talk about moving forward politically without violence, no violence at all, which is a big step here for the IRA. And that results in this.
People celebrated in the streets of West Belfast on August 31st. The Irish Republican Army had just announced a permanent ceasefire in Northern Ireland. The British and Irish governments had insisted on it if the IRA's political party, Sinn Féin, was to participate in peace talks. By October 21st, British Prime Minister John Major was convinced the ceasefire was genuine.
I am now prepared to make a working assumption that the ceasefire is intended to be permanent.
More than 3,000 people have been killed in political violence since 1969. Many in Northern Ireland have suffered, some at the hands of British troops and Protestant paramilitary men, others because of the bombs of the IRA. The ceasefire doesn't mean the IRA has abandoned its goal. It still wants Britain out and Ireland united.
So this big reaction then is the IRA ceasefire. As you heard, on the 31st of August 1994, the IRA began a ceasefire to allow Sinn Féin to participate in talks with other constitutional parties which were completely committed to using politics and not violence. And you can see this front page from the Belfast Telegraph, the day of the ceasefire, countdown to the ceasefire. After 3,168 deaths and 25 years of terror, the IRA says it's over. And you can see some of the real significant IRA violence, moments of violence there, Shankill bombing, Enniskillen, etc. The unionist reaction then, again, mostly overall positive. The Ulster Unionist Party, which used to be referred to as the OUP, now referred to as the Ulster Unionist Party, the UUP. It's the same party, just a different name. Okay, so this is the party of Terence O'Neill. This is the party of Brian Faulkner still. And it's led by, eventually we'll see a man called David Trimble. So the Ulster Unionist Party welcomed the British reassertion of British sovereignty over Northern Ireland, claiming that Northern Ireland was British. And they also welcomed the demand for a peaceful self-determination, essentially that they welcomed that it would require the people of Northern Ireland to change their minds before any United Ireland could take place. It would not be something that could be forced through violence. However, the UUP also worried that the Downing Street Declaration had a green tinge, as they thought it was too focused on Republicans and there wasn't enough in it for unionists. They didn't trust the Irish government to change the constitution to remove Articles 2 and 3. And they wanted assurances that Sinn Féin couldn't join talks without first ending support for the IRA's armed campaign, something which, of course, was going to be quite difficult. Ideally, the UUP wanted the IRA to decommission, which means to get rid of its weapons before Sinn Féin could take part in talks. So their big sticking point is Sinn Féin can't come into talks until the IRA has gotten rid of all of its weapons. This is the reaction, once again, of the DUP and Paisley. It's less than positive. The DUP rejected the declaration entirely as they think it will lead to United Ireland. The DUP is the more hardline of the two main unionist parties in Northern Ireland, and they are not going to be happy at all with any agreement which allows United Ireland to take place. Another unionist response then is this. In 1994, on the 13th of October, the Combined Loyalist Military Command, CLMC, declared a loyalist ceasefire in response to the IRA ceasefire.
The news conference in Belfast this morning, at which the historic loyalist ceasefire announcement came. In front of the media were members of the fringe loyalist political groupings, the Ulster Democratic Party and the Progressive Unionist Party. The words of a supplied statement from the Combined Loyalist Military Command were read by Gusty Spence, a man convicted in the 1960s of the murder of a Catholic.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the instrument, this is the article.
And the key line in the statement was the message that in a little over 6 hours' time, the much anticipated loyalist ceasefire will take effect.
In the belief that the democratically expressed wishes of the greater number of people in Northern Ireland will be respected and upheld, the Combined Loyalist Military Command will universally cease all operational hostilities as from 12 midnight on Thursday, the 13th of October, 1994.
The way I like to remember those two ceasefires is the IRA one comes first, and it's the 31st of August, 3-1 August. The next one then is the Loyalist one, which takes place on the 13th, 1-3 of October. So it's the kind of like a little flip of the numbers there. Another result then of the Downing Street Declaration. Initially, it seems like it doesn't have any progress at all. However, it creates the conditions that allowed a future peace settlement in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, which you will later see. It encouraged Sinn Féin and Republicans to use electoral politics instead of the armed struggle, because they can now achieve a United Ireland through this. And there were some reassurances for unionists which removed fears about a peace process. For example, nothing will take place without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. It's really important to say that without the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, neither the IRA or the Loyalist ceasefires could have come about without it, and that's a massive step towards the peace process in Northern Ireland. You have both paramilitaries from both sides calling an end to hostilities, at least temporarily. You will have pages in your booklet. I know, ignore the numbers on the screen here, but we do have pages that I've photocopied into your booklet, which explain how the IRA ceasefire eventually ends in 1996 in February. There's a little news report here, which you can go and watch as well online. But essentially, the IRA plants a bomb in February 1996 in the Docklands area of London, because they believed that the peace negotiations and the peace talks weren't really working, and they weren't gaining momentum, and that the British were kind of dragging their feet a bit. So they called off their ceasefire to show that they remained serious about their campaign if they couldn't achieve it through peaceful political methods. And that's important then to acknowledge with regards to the Downing Street Declaration itself. It initially seems like it isn't that successful because of the end of the IRA ceasefire. However, it does create the conditions which you will see when we look at the Good Friday Agreement, which result in peace in Northern Ireland eventually. Really, for this, you'll need to know the terms of the agreement, the reactions to the agreement, and the reasons for it. As a name marker, I think it's more likely to be the reasons that it came about, the steps towards it. And as also a name marker, it's possible you could get reactions to the Downing Street Declaration of 1993. But remember, that means nothing if you don't know the difference between the Downing Street Declaration of 1993 and the Downing Street Declaration of 1969. So you need to make sure you know which is which and what each of